I've always been drawn to the wilderness. There's something about the solitude of nature that speaks to my soul. For years, I'd been an avid camper, seeking out the most remote spots to pitch my tent and lose myself in the tranquility of the great outdoors. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the Shadow Forest 2 months ago. My name is Alex, and I'm a freelance photographer. My work often takes me to beautiful, secluded locations, but I'd always managed to keep my professional life separate from my personal passion for solo camping. That is, until that fateful weekend when I decided to combine the two. I'd heard whispers about the Shadow Forest. Fellow hikers spoke of its ancient trees and the eerie silence that seemed to blanket the area. Some even claimed to have experienced strange phenomena there. But I dismissed these stories as campfire tales, designed to spook inexperienced campers. As I packed my gear, I felt a mixture of excitement and anticipation. This was to be my most daring solo trip yet. 3 days alone in one of the most isolated parts of the forest. I double-checked my equipment: tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, camera, and enough food and water to last the weekend. Little did I know that this decision would change my life forever. As I shouldered my backpack and locked my car, I felt a slight shiver run down my spine. I brushed it off as pre-adventure jitters, but looking back, I wonder if it was my subconscious trying to warn me of the horrors that lay ahead. With a deep breath, I stepped onto the trail that led into the Shadow Forest, blissfully unaware that I was walking into a nightmare from which I might never fully awaken. The moment I entered the Shadow Forest, I knew this place was different. The air seemed thicker, almost oppressive, as if the forest itself was breathing. Towering trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to create a dense canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. What little light did filter through cast strange, shifting shadows on the forest floor. As I hiked deeper into the woods, an unsettling silence enveloped me. There were no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an eerie stillness that seemed to swallow every sound I made. My footsteps on the leaf-strewn path sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet. After several hours of hiking, I came across a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was surrounded by ancient, gnarled trees that seemed to lean inward, as if they were curious observers. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I saw nothing except the endless sea of trees. I set about pitching my tent, the familiar routine helping to calm my nerves. As I hammered the stakes into the ground, I couldn't help but notice how the sound echoed strangely, as if the forest was amplifying it and then swallowing it whole. With my camp set up, I decided to explore the immediate area before nightfall. The fading light created long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. More than once, I spun around, certain I had seen something dart between the trees, only to find nothing there. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. The shadows deepened, and an unsettling mist began to rise from the ground. The trees, which had seemed merely old and imposing in the daylight, now took on a menacing aspect. Their twisted branches reached out like gnarled fingers, and I could have sworn I saw faces in the patterns of their bark. I retreated to my tent, zipping it up tightly as if it could protect me from the growing sense of dread. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I tried to rationalize my fears. I was an experienced camper, after all. There was nothing in these woods that I couldn't handle. But as I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that I was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. I'm not sure how long I slept before the whispers began. At first, they were so faint that I thought I was dreaming. But as I slowly regained consciousness, the sounds became clearer, more insistent. They weren't words exactly, but a series of sibilant hisses that seemed to come from all around me. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding in my chest. The interior of my tent was pitch black, the darkness so complete it felt like a physical presence pressing against my skin. I fumbled for my flashlight, my trembling fingers finally finding the switch. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar contours of my tent. Everything seemed normal, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe it had all been a dream. But then I heard it again. A soft, insidious whisper that seemed to come from just outside the thin fabric of my tent. I held my breath, straining my ears. The whispers continued, rising and falling like the tide, sometimes so quiet I could barely hear them, other times loud enough that I could almost, but not quite, make out words. It was maddening, like trying to understand a conversation in a language I didn't speak. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I slowly unzipped the tent flap. The sound of the zipper seemed obscenely loud in the unnatural quiet of the forest. As I poked my head out, the whispers abruptly ceased. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, casting everything in an eerie, silvery glow. The mist I'd noticed earlier had thickened, swirling around the bases of the trees like ghostly tendrils. I swept my flashlight beam across the campsite, half expecting to see something. But there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just the silent, looming presence of the ancient trees. I stepped out of the tent, the damp earth cold beneath my bare feet. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I did a slow 360, searching for anything out of place, any sign of what could have made those sounds. As I completed my turn, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I whirled, flashlight beam cutting through the mist, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. But I could have sworn I saw something, a darker shape moving within the darkness, there and gone in an instant. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Cold sweat trickled down my back. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, to flee this place and never look back. But where would I go? I was miles from anywhere, surrounded by unfamiliar forest in the dead of night. With no other choice, I retreated to my tent, zipping it closed with shaking hands. I knew the thin fabric offered no ray-all protection, but it was better than nothing. As I huddled in my sleeping bag, I strained my ears, listening for the whispers to return. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, just as exhaustion began to overtake me, I heard it again. A soft, sibilant sound, like wind through leaves, but there was no breeze. And this time, I could almost make out words. You belong to us. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. Every time I began to drift off, a new sound would jerk me back to wakefulness. A twig snapping, a rustle in the underbrush, or worst of all, those infernal whispers. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the trees, I was a jittery, exhausted mess. I unzipped the tent with trembling hands, half expecting to find some nightmarish creature waiting for me. But the clearing looked exactly as it had the day before. The morning mist was already beginning to dissipate, and I could hear the faint calls of birds in the distance. It all seemed so normal that I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Almost. Determined to find a rational explanation for the night's events, I decided to explore the area around my campsite. The forest looked different in the pale morning light, less menacing, but no less strange. The trees still seemed to loom over me, their gnarled branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. As I walked, I kept my eyes peeled for any signs of animals that might have caused the noises I'd heard. But I saw no tracks, no droppings, not even a tuft of fur caught on a branch. It was as if this part of the forest was completely devoid of wildlife. I had wandered farther from my camp than I intended when I saw it. A flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. But then I saw it again. A dark shape darting between two distant trunks. I broke into a run, determined to catch whatever it was, to prove to myself that there was a logical explanation for everything that had happened. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, but every time I thought I was getting close, the shape would disappear, only to reappear farther away. It was like chasing a shadow, always just out of reach, always one step ahead. Finally, out of breath and disoriented, I stopped. As I stood there, panting, I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea where I was. The trees all looked the same, and in my mad dash, I had lost all sense of direction. Panic began to set in as I spun in a circle, trying to get my bearings. And that's when I saw them. Shadows moving among the trees, darker than the surrounding gloom, flitting from trunk to trunk. They seemed to be all around me, closing in. With a strangled cry, I turned and ran, no longer caring about the direction, just desperate to get away from those moving shadows and back to the relative safety of my tent. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. When I finally stumbled back into my campsite, the sun had fully risen, casting a deceptively cheerful light over the clearing. For a moment, I stood there, gulping in air, trying to process what I had just experienced. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. My tent, which I had left in perfect condition, was in tatters. The fabric hung in shreds, as if it had been mauled by some enormous beast. But it wasn't the destruction that chilled me to my core. It was the marks left behind. Long, deep gashes ran across what remained of the tent. They weren't the random tears of an animal attack. These were deliberate. 5 parallel lines, repeated over and over, like the marks of a giant, clawed hand. I approached slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. As I got closer, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the soft earth around the destroyed tent. But these weren't human footprints, nor did they belong to any animal I recognized. They were large, easily twice the size of my own feet, with long, sharp toes that dug deep into the soil. And there were dozens of them, circling the tent, overlapping each other as if whatever made them had paced around and around my sleeping form all night. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke or a hallucination brought on by lack of sleep. But as I moved, my foot caught on something. I looked down and saw a tuft of coarse, dark hair snagged on a root. It was like no fur I'd ever seen before, thick and oily, with an odd greenish tint in the sunlight. Panic overwhelmed me. I had to get out of there. I didn't care about my destroyed equipment or the mystery of what had happened. All I knew was that I was in danger, and every instinct screamed at me to run. I grabbed my backpack, which thankfully had been outside the tent and was untouched. With shaking hands, I stuffed in whatever supplies I could find scattered around the campsite. All the while, I felt watched. The forest, which had seemed so silent before, now seemed alive with hidden menace. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch sounded like a threat. As I shouldered my pack, ready to flee, a gust of wind swept through the clearing. And with it came that whisper again, louder now, almost clear enough to understand. It seemed to say, "Stay. You belong to the forest." I ran. I ran like I've never run before in my life. I didn't know if I was going in the right direction. I didn't care. All I wanted was to put as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me, but I kept going. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that green twilight beneath the trees. But eventually, mercifully, I saw light ahead. The trees were thinning. With a final burst of energy, I broke through the tree line and found myself on the road where I had parked my car. I've never been so glad to see a stretch of asphalt in my life. My car sat where I had left it, a beautiful sight of normality amidst the madness I'd just experienced. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. As I wrenched open the door, I glanced back at the forest. The trees stood silently, their branches swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. For a moment, it all looked so peaceful, so ordinary, that I almost doubted my own memories. But then I saw it, a flicker of movement just inside the tree line. A shadow darker than it should be, moving in a way shadows shouldn't move. I threw myself into the car, slammed the door, and cranked the engine. The familiar rumble was reassuring, a connection to the normal world I'd left behind. I floored the accelerator, tires squealing as I peeled away from that godforsaken forest. As I drove, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerging from the trees, pursuing me. But the road behind remained empty. Gradually, the thick canopy of the shadow forest gave way to more open woodland, and finally to the familiar landscapes of civilization. But even as the miles stretched between me and that haunted place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly free. The whispers seemed to echo in my mind, and every shadow I passed seemed to flicker with hidden movement. I drove for hours, not stopping, not daring to slow down. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of my city that I finally felt safe enough to pull over. I sat there, in a nondescript gas station parking lot, and let out a sob I didn't know I'd been holding in. What had happened back there? What were those things I saw? Those whispers I heard? The rational part of my mind tried to come up with explanations. Stress, lack of sleep, and overactive imagination. But I knew, deep in my bones, that what I had experienced was real. As I finally pulled myself together and drove the last few miles to my apartment, I made a vow. I would never set foot in those woods again. I would warn others, do whatever I could to keep people away from the shadow forest. But even as I made this promise to myself, a small, traitorous part of my mind whispered that it might already be too late. That perhaps, in some way, I had never truly left the forest at all. The days following my escape from the shadow forest passed in a blur. I tried to return to my normal life, but the memories of that night haunted my every waking moment. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford, plagued as I was by nightmares of moving shadows and whispered threats. Desperate for answers, I threw myself into researching the shadow forest. I scoured local libraries, pored over old newspapers, and spent countless hours online searching for any information about the area. What I found chilled me to the bone. The forest, it seemed, had a long and dark history. Local legends spoke of people vanishing without a trace, of strange lights seen dancing between the trees at night, and of eerie whispers carried on the wind. Some accounts dated back centuries, passed down through generations of settlers and indigenous people alike. One story in particular caught my attention. In 1923, a group of loggers had ventured into the heart of the shadow forest. Only one man returned, babbling about living shadows and trees that whispered. He was committed to an asylum, where he spent the rest of his days drawing intricate patterns that looked disturbingly like the claw marks I had seen on my tent. As I delved deeper into these tales, I began to notice strange occurrences around me. At first, they were small things. A shadow in the corner of my eye that vanished when I turned to look, or the faint sound of whispers just on the edge of hearing. I tried to dismiss them as products of my stressed and sleep-deprived mind. But then things escalated. One morning, I woke to find my houseplants had grown exponentially overnight. their vines creeping across my bedroom floor in impossible patterns. Another day, I could have sworn I saw a dark, hunched shape darting between cars in the parking lot of my apartment complex. These incidents left me shaken, convinced that whatever dwelled in the shadow forest had followed me home. The forest's tendrils seemed to be reaching out, trying to reclaim me. I began to wonder if I would ever truly escape its grasp. As weeks turned into months, the echoes of my experience in the shadow forest continued to reverberate through my life. My work suffered. I couldn't focus on my photography, and when I did manage to take pictures, they always seemed to come out wrong. Shadows where there should be light, strange blurs that looked almost like faces. Sleep became my enemy. On the rare nights when exhaustion finally overcame my fear, my dreams were vivid and terrifying. I would find myself back in the forest, running from unseen pursuers, their whispers growing louder and louder until I woke up screaming, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. During my waking hours, the whispers persisted. They were always just on the edge of comprehension, like a radio tuned between stations. Sometimes, in moments of quiet, I could almost make out words. Return, belong to us. My relationships began to suffer. Friends and family grew concerned about my increasingly erratic behavior. I couldn't explain to them what was happening. How could I, when I barely understood it myself? I withdrew, isolating myself in my apartment, surrounded by my research and the ever-growing plants that seemed to thrive despite my neglect. One particularly bad night, after hours of tossing and turning, I got up to get a glass of water. As I passed my living room window, I froze. There, in the street below, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and seemed to be made of shadow itself. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, it turned its head towards me. I couldn't make out any features, but I felt its gaze lock onto mine. In that moment, the whispers in my head crescendoed into a roar. "Come back," they demanded. "You belong to the forest." I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet in my haste to get away from the window. When I finally gathered the courage to look again, the figure was gone. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it had been real. The next day, I began to make plans. I couldn't stay here, couldn't keep living like this. Whatever had followed me from the shadow forest wasn't going to let me go. I needed to get far away, to find somewhere safe where I could figure out how to break free from this nightmare. As I packed my bags, my eyes fell on the camera I had taken into the forest. I hadn't used it since that night, too afraid of what I might see. With trembling hands, I turned it on and began to scroll through the photos. Most were as I remembered: trees, the clearing, my campsite. But the last photo made my blood run cold. It showed my tent at night, illuminated by the flash. And there, just visible at the edge of the frame, was a dark, elongated hand reaching towards the tent. A hand with long, sharp claws. I dropped the camera, my decision made. I had to leave. Before the forest could reclaim me for good. It's been a year since I fled my apartment, leaving behind everything I knew. I've traveled across the country, never staying in one place for too long, always looking over my shoulder. The whispers have faded to a dull murmur, but they never truly disappear. They're a constant reminder of the horror I experienced and the shadow that still looms over my life. I've tried to make sense of what happened in the shadow forest, to reconcile the inexplicable events with the rational world I once knew. But the truth is, there are things in this world that defy explanation, forces that exist beyond our understanding. The shadow forest is one such place, a nexus of otherworldly power that has left an indelible mark on my soul. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever be free of its influence. Will I spend the rest of my life running, always one step ahead of the shadows that seek to reclaim me? Or will I find a way to break this connection, to sever the invisible threads that still bind me to that haunted place? I don't have the answers. But I know this: the world is stranger and more terrifying than most people realize. There are dark corners where ancient, nameless things dwell, waiting for unwary travelers to stumble into their domain. The Shadow Forest is one such place, and I fear it's not the only one. To anyone reading this, heed my warning. Be careful where you tread. The wilderness holds secrets, and some of them are best left undiscovered. And if you ever find yourself near the Shadow Forest, turn back. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, do not enter those woods. For once the forest claims you, it never truly lets you go. The whispers may fade, but the shadows are always watching. Looking back, I still can't believe how a simple camping trip changed my life forever. My name is Alex, and I used to be just another heartbroken 20-something living in the city. 6 months ago, my world crumbled when my partner of 3 years left me for someone else. I thought I had my life figured out, but suddenly I was lost, drifting through each day in a haze of confusion and pain. It was a sweltering summer day when I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The constant reminders of my ex, the pitying looks from friends, the suffocating feeling of failure. I needed to get away from it all. That's when I remembered the remote forest I'd heard about, known for its untouched beauty and solitude. Perfect, I thought. Just what I need to clear my head and find myself again. I threw some camping gear into my old pickup truck and hit the road, leaving behind a vague message for my worried parents. The drive was long, the radio my only company as I watched the urban sprawl give way to rolling hills and eventually dense woodland. As I neared my destination, the paved road turned to gravel, then to little more than a dirt track. By late afternoon, I reached the trailhead. The forest loomed before me, a wall of green that seemed to whisper promises of peace and isolation. I shouldered my backpack, its weight a comforting reminder of my self-reliance, and plunged into the woods. The hike was more challenging than I'd anticipated. The trail, overgrown in places, wound its way through towering trees and over babbling brooks. But with each step, I felt the weight of my heartbreak lifting, replaced by a growing sense of adventure and freedom. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I found the perfect spot to make camp. A small clearing near a gentle stream, surrounded by ancient-looking oaks. I set up my tent with practiced ease, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for my first night alone in the wilderness. Sitting by the crackling flames, I gazed up at the star-filled sky peeking through the canopy above. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The forest was alive with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But instead of feeling scared, I felt embraced by nature. As I crawled into my sleeping bag that night, I had no idea that this sense of tranquility was merely the calm before the storm. I drifted off to sleep, blissfully unaware of the terrifying events that awaited me in the days to come. The next 2 days were exactly what I needed. I woke with the sun, its rays filtering through the trees and warming my tent. Mornings were spent exploring the area around my campsite, marveling at the beauty of dew-covered spider webs and vibrant wildflowers pushing up through the forest floor. I hiked for hours each day, losing myself in the rhythm of my footsteps and the gentle sounds of the forest. The physical exertion felt good, burning away the lingering ache in my chest. At times, I found myself smiling for no reason, a simple joy I hadn't experienced in months. In the afternoons, I'd return to my camp to read or write in my journal. I poured out my feelings onto the pages, exorcising the demons of my failed relationship. With each word, I felt lighter, more like myself again. But as peaceful as those days were, there were moments when an odd feeling would creep over me. Sometimes, when I paused during a hike to catch my breath, I could swear I felt eyes on me. I'd spin around, heart racing, only to find nothing but trees and shadows. I chalked it up to my imagination, to being alone in the woods for the first time. On the evening of the second day, as I sat by my campfire roasting marshmallows, that feeling intensified. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the darkness between the trees deeper. A shiver ran down my spine, and I found myself drawing closer to the fire's warmth. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I was being silly. But as I zipped myself into my tent that night, I couldn't help but feel that something had changed. The peace of the forest suddenly felt fragile, like a bubble about to burst. I jolted awake in the middle of the night, my heart pounding. Something had pulled me from my sleep, but what? The forest was eerily quiet, the usual nighttime sounds muted. I held my breath, straining my ears. That's when I heard it, a whisper, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. But there it was again, clearer this time. Alex, it seemed to say, my name carried on the breeze that rustled through the trees. I sat up, fumbling for my flashlight. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and scared in the vast darkness. No response came, just another whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Unzipping my tent with shaking hands, I stepped out into the night. The moon hung low and full, casting long shadows that danced and swayed in the gentle wind. I swung my flashlight in a wide arc, its beam cutting through the darkness, but revealing nothing but trees and undergrowth. "Is anyone there?" I tried again, louder this time. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. I stood there for what felt like hours, every nerve on edge, waiting for something. But nothing came. Eventually, the normal sounds of the forest slowly returned. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Exhausted and unsettled, I crawled back into my tent. I tried to rationalize what had happened. It was just the wind, I told myself. The branches creaking, leaves rustling. My mind was playing tricks on me, turning natural sounds into whispers. But as I drifted into an uneasy sleep, a part of me knew I was lying to myself. Something had changed in the forest, and I was no longer sure if I was as alone as I had thought. The next morning, I woke to golden sunlight filtering through my tent, the horrors of the night seeming like a distant nightmare. But the uneasy feeling lingered, prompting me to pack a day bag and set out to explore further into the forest. I told myself I was just being adventurous, but deep down, I knew I was searching for answers. I hiked for hours, pushing deeper into the woods than I had before. The trees seemed to grow older here, their trunks wider, their canopy denser. The air felt heavier, filled with the musty scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. It was early afternoon when I saw the first one, a strange symbol carved into the trunk of a massive oak. I approached it cautiously, running my fingers over the rough grooves. It looked ancient, the edges smoothed by time, yet it felt wrong somehow, as if the tree had grown around it rather than having been carved. Intrigued and unsettled, I pressed on. Soon, I found more symbols, each different yet somehow connected, like letters in an unknown alphabet. They appeared more frequently as I continued, turning my hike into a bizarre treasure hunt. Then I saw them. Small figures hanging from the branches, swaying gently in the breeze. At first, I thought they were some kind of strange fruit, but as I got closer, I realized they were crafted from twigs and leaves, bound together with what looked like hair. My heart raced as I reached out to touch one. It spun slowly, revealing a crude face fashioned from bark. I recoiled, stumbling backward, my foot catching on a root. I fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. As I lay there, gasping for breath, the whispers returned. They seemed to come from the figures, from the carved trees, from the very air around me. "Alex," they called, more insistent now. "You're here." Finally. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet and ran, branches whipping at my face as I tore through the underbrush. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, only slowing when I recognized the path back to my campsite. As I stumbled into the clearing, I realized with growing horror that my safe haven had been transformed. The same symbols now adorned the trees surrounding my tent, and tiny twig figures hung from every branch. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each passing moment. I was no longer alone in this forest, and whatever was out there knew my name. Sleep eluded me that night. Every rustle, every crack of a twig sent my heart racing. The whispers never truly stopped. They just ebbed and flowed like an otherworldly tide. By dawn, I was a frayed bundle of nerves, torn between fleeing and needing to understand what was happening. As the first light of day filtered through the trees, I made a decision. I would follow the whispers to their source. With shaking hands, I packed a small bag with water, energy bars, and a flashlight. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the forest. The whispers led me deeper into the woods than I'd ever been before. The trees grew impossibly old and gnarled, their branches twisting together overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with an ancient, musty scent. I lost track of time as I walked, my surroundings becoming a blur of twisted trunks and shadow. Just as I was about to give up, convinced I was lost, the trees suddenly parted. I stumbled into a circular clearing and froze, my breath catching in my throat. In the center stood a massive stone altar, its surface stained dark with what I prayed was just ages of weathering. Strange symbols, similar to those I'd seen on the trees, were carved into its sides. The whispers grew louder here, seeming to emanate from the altar itself. Drawn by a force I couldn't understand, I approached the altar. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift as I stared at them, making my head spin. I reached out, my fingertips barely brushing the cool stone. Instantly, a jolt of energy surged through me. Visions flashed before my eyes. Hooded figures, ancient rituals, something dark and terrifying awakening. I yanked my hand back with a cry, stumbling away from the altar. As I backed away, my foot caught on something. I looked down to see a human skull half buried in the leaves, its empty sockets staring up at me accusingly. Terror gripped me, and I turned to run, but found my path blocked by dark hooded figures emerging from the trees. I was surrounded. Hooded figures stood silently at the edge of the clearing, their faces hidden in shadow. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to move. One figure stepped forward, taller than the rest. When it spoke, its voice was a harsh whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Welcome, chosen one. We have waited so long for your arrival." Who are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure pulled back its hood, revealing a face that was unsettlingly ageless. Neither young nor old, neither male nor female. Its eyes were completely black, like bottomless pits. "We are the keepers of the old ways, guardians of secrets long forgotten by your world." Another figure spoke up, its voice reedy and thin. "The forest called to you, Alex. It recognized your pain, your isolation. It knew you were the one we needed." My mind reeled. How did they know my name? What did they mean by the one they needed? I don't understand, I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. What do you want from me? The leader stepped closer, and I had to fight the urge to back away. You are destined to complete a ritual, Alex. A ritual that will awaken something ancient and powerful. Something that has slumbered for millennia, waiting for the right vessel. Cold dread washed over me as the implications of their words sank in. No, I said, shaking my head violently. You've got the wrong person. I'm nobody special. I just came here to camp, to get away from my life. A low chuckle rippled through the group. There are no coincidences, chosen one. Your arrival here was foretold ages ago. Your pain, your solitude. They have prepared you for this moment. As they spoke, the whispers I'd been hearing grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the altar now, calling my name, promising power beyond imagining. The ritual must be completed tonight, the leader said, gesturing toward the altar, when the moon is full and the veil between worlds is thinnest. Fear and desperation surged through me. I couldn't let this happen. Whatever they were planning, whatever they wanted to awaken, I knew it was something terrible. Something that should remain asleep. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I feinted to the left, then darted right, slipping between two of the hooded figures. Their surprised shouts followed me as I plunged into the forest, running as fast as my legs could carry me. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I could hear them behind me, their whispers now angry shouts. As I ran, one thought pounded in my mind. I had to escape, had to warn someone. But who would believe such a crazy story? I ran blindly through the forest, my lungs burning and my heart pounding in my ears. The angry shouts of my pursuers echoed behind me, spurring me on despite my exhaustion. Branches clawed at my face and arms, leaving stinging scratches, but I didn't dare slow down. As I ran, the forest seemed to come alive around me. Roots appeared to shift beneath my feet, threatening to trip me. Vines hung low, as if trying to ensnare me. Was it my panicked imagination, or was the forest itself trying to stop my escape? I had no idea which direction I was going. The dense canopy overhead blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving me disoriented in the shadowy undergrowth. All I knew was that I had to put as much distance as possible between myself and those hooded figures. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet disappeared. I tumbled down a steep embankment, rolling through leaves and mud before splashing into an icy stream. The shock of the cold water momentarily stunned me, but the sound of pursuit snapped me back to reality. I scrambled to my feet, soaked and shivering, and looked around frantically. The stream cut a path through the forest. Perhaps it could lead me to safety. With no better option, I began to wade downstream, hoping the water would mask my trail. As I moved, I became aware of whispers once again, but these were different from before. They seemed to come from the water itself, urgent and afraid. "Hurry," they seemed to say. "They're coming." I didn't need to be told twice. I broke into a run, splashing through the shallow stream. The whispers grew more insistent, guiding me. Left, they'd hiss, and I'd veer left to avoid a deep pool. "Duck," they'd warn, and I'd duck under a low-hanging branch. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw it, a break in the trees ahead. Sunlight streamed through, promising safety. With a final burst of energy, I sprinted towards the light. But as I burst out of the tree lean, my heart sank. I found myself back in the clearing with the stone altar. The hooded figures were waiting, their dark eyes gleaming with triumph. "Did you really think you could escape us, chosen one?" The leader's voice dripped with amusement. The forest itself guides you to your destiny. I spun around, looking for any way out, but the clearing was completely surrounded. My legs trembled, threatening to give out from exhaustion and fear. "Please," I gasped. "I'm not who you think I am. I can't be part of your ritual." The leader approached, its black eyes boring into mine. "You still don't understand, do you? It's not about who you think you are. It's about who you're meant to be." As it spoke, the whispers returned full force, swirling around me like a tornado of sound. But now I could almost understand them. Ancient words, promises of power, glimpses of knowledge beyond human comprehension. "The Old One chose you, Alex," another hooded figure said, stepping forward. "It has slumbered for millennia, waiting for the right vessel. Your pain, your isolation, they've made you perfect." The leader placed a hand on my shoulder, its touch sending icy shivers down my spine. "Don't fight it. Embrace your destiny. Let the Old One in, and you'll never be alone or powerless again." For a moment, I felt myself wavering. The whispers were so tempting, offering an escape from the pain and loneliness that had driven me to this forest in the first place. But then I remembered the skull-eyed scene, the dark stains on the altar. Whatever this Old One was, its awakening would come at a terrible price. "No," I said, surprised by the strength in my voice. "I won't be your vessel. I won't help you wake this thing." The leader's face contorted with rage. "You fool! You don't have a choice." It gestured to the others, who began to advance, forming a tight circle around me. As they closed in, the whispers reached a fever pitch. The symbols on the altar began to glow with an eerie light. The very air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. In that moment of desperation, a crazy idea struck me. If the forest had guided me here, if it was somehow connected to this Old One, maybe I could use that connection. I closed my eyes and focused, reaching out with my mind like I had when I touched the altar. "Help me," I thought desperately. "I don't want this. Please, help me stop them." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening crack, the ground began to shake. The earth trembled beneath our feet, sending the hooded figures stumbling. Trees groaned and swayed dangerously, their roots breaking through the soil. In the chaos, I saw my chance. I lunged for the stone altar, my hands finding purchase on its rough surface. The whispers in my head reached a crescendo, no longer tempting but urgent and afraid. I understood then. The forest, the Old One, they were connected, but not in the way the cultists believed. "You're wrong," I shouted over the din. "The Old One doesn't want to wake up. It's been protecting itself, protecting the world from whatever you're trying to do." The leader's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in fury. "Lies," it hissed, lunging toward me. "The ritual must be completed." As its hands closed around my throat, I felt a surge of energy course through me from the altar. Acting on instinct, I grabbed the leader's wrists. There was a blinding flash of light, and suddenly I could see everything. Centuries of history flooded my mind. The Old One's slumber, the forest growing to protect it, the cultists' misguided attempts to wake a power they couldn't comprehend. I saw the truth of the ritual, the devastation it would cause if completed. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I pushed the leader away. "It's over," I said, my voice resonating with a power that wasn't entirely my own. "The Old One rejects your ritual. This ends now." I slammed my fist down on the altar. Cracks spread across its surface, light pouring from within. The cultists screamed as the ground split open beneath their feet, swallowing them into the earth. As quickly as it had begun, the chaos subsided. The forest fell silent, the whispers fading to a gentle hum. I stood alone in the clearing, the destroyed altar before me, realizing the true nature of my escape had only just begun. The forest was deathly quiet as I stumbled away from the ruined altar. The events of the past few hours felt like a surreal dream, but the aches in my body and the lingering whispers in my mind were all too real. I had no idea which direction would lead me out of the forest, but I knew I couldn't stay here. With each step, I felt the weight of what had happened pressing down on me. The Old One's knowledge still swirled in my head, fragments of ancient secrets and cosmic truths that no human was meant to bear. As I walked, I became aware of a subtle shift in the forest around me. The oppressive atmosphere that had built up over the past days was lifting. Sunlight began to filter through the canopy more strongly, and I could hear birds singing again. The whispers, once menacing and then urgent, now seemed to guide me gently. They weren't words anymore, but rather a feeling, a subtle pull in a certain direction. I followed, too exhausted to do anything else. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time felt fluid, meaningless. I walked in a daze, my mind struggling to process everything that had happened. Occasionally, I'd stop to drink from a stream or eat some berries that I somehow knew were safe, guided by the lingering knowledge of the Old One. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, the trees began to thin. The pull I'd been following grew stronger, more insistent. With a final push, I broke through the tree line and found myself back at the trailhead where my journey had begun. My truck was still there, covered in a fine layer of dust as if I'd been gone for weeks rather than days. As I approached it, the last of the whispers faded from my mind, leaving behind a profound silence. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I inserted the key. As the engine roared to life, I looked back at the forest one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw a shimmer in the air, like a veil settling back into place. Then it was gone, and I was alone with the weight of a secret I knew I could never share. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.